Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of History with Tony. We are talking about the decadent decades, the mobsters and desperados of the 1920s and the 1930s. This is, to me, it's been a pretty interesting so far. Let's kind of look at what we've talked about last week. We looked at how the La Cosa Nostra, what we call the mafia in America, originated on the island of Sicily and saw how the constant warfare over the island created a siege mentality amongst its natives, which ultimately led to the creation of what is generally called the mafia in America. We first looked at how the families, or what they call casca, developed, which depended on self reliance, vendettas, and vows of silence, omerta. And then we looked at the legend of the War of the Sicilian Vespers, which occurred in the 13th century, which supposedly gave rise to the name of the mafia by the use of an acronym, Morte alla Francia Italia Anilia, which means death to the French is Italy's crime. And again, I apologize for my pronunciation of Italian. It's not very well. We then looked at how the unification of Italy in the second half of the 19th century resulted in Sicily being governed in part by the Casca, which developed into crime families that we now call the mafia in America. Finally, we saw how Mussolini uh, gained control of Italy in the 1920s, early 1920s, and he decided to make a violent effort to subdue the mafia in Sicily since they were threatening his regime. And he, with the work of a man who's called the Iron Prefect, uh, actually arrested and subdued most of the mafia in Sicily for a time being. He didn't end the mafia by any means. He just kind of made it go underground. But one of the offshoots of Mussolini's efforts to subdue the mafia was a lot of the old mafia overlords and padrones and some of the soldiers actually immigrated to America, bringing with them what we now know as the mafia. So, today, we are going to talk about coming to America, the Italian immigration between the 1880s and 1920s, which led to, in part, the origin of the American Mafia. To introduce this, we're going to listen to little Enrico Caruso, who was probably the most famous Italian coming to America during this period of time, singing just a little bit smidget of one of his famous oratos.
Mamma mia si salterà, presto in fondo, donne mie, venite qua, un garzon belleggio con ciascuno toccherà, finché in ciel prende una stella e la luna splenderà, il più bel con la più bella tutta notte.
All right, started.
Okay, well, unfortunately, the sound, I don't think I had the sound turned up very loud on that. I apologize for that. Well, coming to America, last week we saw how the unification of Italy uh, led to basically Sicily kind of going its own way. So while this unification effort, the Risorgimento, it did not bring prosperity to the millions of landless peasants and laborers living in poverty on the peninsula, and particularly in Sicily. The unification did not have its effect in Sicily that they thought it would. With no hope of improving their lives, millions were drawn to the open door immigration policy of the United States in the late 19th century. And as a result, by 1920, over 4 million Italians had arrived in America, most going through the immigration center located on Ellis Island. So, where did they go? Well, most of them settled in urban northeastern cities of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Buffalo, although several also went to large Midwestern cities like Chicago, St. Louis, and in particular New Orleans. Uh, Housing was almost always in the poorest areas, and the enclaves of Italians gathered in neighborhoods which became known as Little Italy. These overcrowded and unhealthy areas were dominated by tenements, which contributed to high rates of disease, mortality, and crime. So here's a picture of Ellis Island, located, in the harbor of New York City. Little information about Ellis Island in case you're interested. I don't know if anybody's ever been there. I haven't. I've been to the Statue of Liberty, but we didn't go over to Ellis Island, which is actually part of the national park. Ellis Island was opened in 1892 and closed in 1954. And during that period of time, over 20 million immigrants were processed there. Between 1905 and 1914, an average of 1 million immigrants a year passed through the terminal, averaging about 5,000 a day. After it was closed in 1954, it was remodeled and reopened in the mid-60s as part of the Statue of Liberty National Park Service. So if you go to New York City, I would encourage you to go to Ellis Island. It's something I always wanted to do, just didn't have time when I went there. So a couple of views of Little Italy. One of them is the Washington Street looking at the Manhattan Bridge, one of the most famous photographs of New York City. You can look down through Washington Street on the Brooklyn side of New York City, and you can look at the Manhattan Bridge. That's not the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is a little bit north of that, I understand. And then there was Mulberry Street in Little Italy in lower Manhattan, one of the most probably heavily and densely populated areas in America at that period of time. These are colorized photos, which I don't normally use colorized photos, but I thought today I just thought it might be interesting to see these areas that it would have looked in the early 1900s. Just a different life, I think, than we probably can imagine. So, pardon me here. Sorry, so I was going to have to sneeze for a minute. The immigrant Italians, just like the Irish, the Germans, and the Jews before them, established enclaves where they tried to live life much as they had in the old country. They wanted to bring with them their own traditions. In New York City, they settled in what is now the east side of lower Manhattan, around Mulberry Street. We just saw that, as well as the Bensonhurst and Williamsburg neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Howard Beach and the Queens, and East Harlem. These were the main areas. I'll show you a map here in a minute of these Italian enclaves. Between 1880 and 1900, the number of Italians in New York City grew from a meager 20,000 in 1880 to an astonishing 250,000. And by 1910, Italians accounted for 500,000 New Yorkers, about 1/10 of the total city's population. So it was really just a huge influx of Italians. One block of Manhattan's Little Italy was known as the Bend, where Mulberry Street made a sharp turn. It was one of the most densely populated areas in the United States. Census records indicate the block of tenements had 132 rooms containing 1,324 immigrants sleeping in tiered bunks. In other words, about 10 to a room. It's hard for us, I think, to imagine living in those conditions. I grew up pretty poor, but, we had room and we had a yard and we had we could grow a garden and we could play outside. It was not the case on Mulberry Street for sure in the early 1900s. So, kind of give you an idea of where these Italian enclaves were. What we traditionally call Little Italy was in the lower part of Manhattan, about a 4 square block area. And I'll show you a more detailed map in a minute of that area. That's the most famous of the Italian enclaves, although there were 4 others. One of them was in what was called East Harlem, which is this area over here. And then down in Brooklyn, in this borough, there was one across the river from Little Italy and Manhattan at what was called the Williamsburg neighborhood. And further south towards Coney Island, this is Coney Island right here, there was what was called the Bensonhurst neighborhood. And finally, over in Queens, there was Howard's Beach, which was around Jamaica Bay. So as you can see, this is the areas that primarily became the Italian enclaves, which would eventually give rise to what we generally call the mafia. Now, this is a little bit more of a detailed map. If you were to go to New York City today and go down to the lower part of Manhattan, you would find what was generally called Little Italy, which is this 4th Street area here. It was bounded on the north by Houston Street, on the east by the Bowery Street, on the south by Canal Street, and by the west, primarily Lafayette Street. Now, it was a little bit bigger than this at one time, but this is basically the area now. And you can see the 3 cross streets here, Mulberry Street, which I've showed you a couple of pictures of, as well as Mott Street and Elizabeth Street. So this is the little area, Little Italy area, and it was just an extremely densely populated area. Now, into this stepped Jacob Riis. He called it the foul core of New York slums. That's not my words, that's his words. He was a Danish immigrant who had come to America in the post-Civil War era seeking the American dream, as did most immigrants. After years of struggling to find employment, he became a police reporter for the New York Tribune and was stationed in the press office across the street from the police headquarters on Mulberry Street. There was a police headquarters on Mulberry Street, which is ironic because that was the area where most of the crime in Little Italy took place. He also became an amateur photographer as well, and he soon began recording life in Little Italy with his camera, which later formed the core of a book that was called How the Other Half Lives. It's kind of a photo essay book. And his book and his subsequent speaking tour contributed significantly to the cause of urban reform in the U.S. And I've always said, if a picture is indeed worth 1,000 words, as it said, then Riis's photography really conveyed the life of misery that these Italians faced in Little Italy better than anything I could tell you about. So this is Jacob Riis, and we owe him a great deal of gratitude because it due to him that we can look back at how the Italians in New York's Little Italy lived 100 plus years ago. So let's just look at a few of these photographs, and I'm going to leave them up here for a second or two to let you really look in because they really portray what life would have been like. The first one is one of the tenements. As you can see, it's just a horribly dilapidated building. These were not well kept by any means at all. This is the back of one of the tenements where they hung their clothes out. You can see kids hanging out, as well as women tending to the laundry here. Then this is another view of an alleyway between one of the tenements. Again, you can see the kids standing here. Looks like some adults standing in the background. Another view that I think we've already seen. And then we've got, this is a really depressing view. One of the men, I'm not for sure what it is. He obviously has been working, and you can see smoking his pipe. I don't know if that's his dinner. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's a barrel of charcoal to heat with, but it's a pretty depressing place to live, that's for sure. And here's a family living in one of the tenements. Again, folks, I could talk to you all day about how these people lived and never convey the way they had to live any better than these photographs show you. A couple of photographs of people working because this is how they made their living. They did a lot of what we call cottage industry. A woman doing, looked like probably crocheting or doing some kind of needlework, sort of little clay pipe that she's smoking. And here's a photograph of obviously a family doing tailoring and working on clothing. And again, I thought that was a pretty interesting picture there. I'm assuming that's a young female. She's smiling, which is something you don't see very often in these photographs. And then there's this photograph. Well, these two photographs. These are photographs of a couple of groups of young boys. Kids normally didn't go to school very often and for very long if they did. And a lot of them ended up living out on the street, playing craps, sleeping, in the subway, areas in the in over the grates, the heating grates. It's just a terrible way, and you can kind of figure out why some of these young men, as I grew up, drifted towards a life of crime. And then there's this photograph. This photograph is one that really haunts me. I read about this photograph. Jacob Reese said he was taking photographs, and this little 8-year-old girl walked by, and he asked her if he could take her picture, and she just kind of walked over and stood by the wall. And he asked her what her name was, and she said that basically she couldn't speak English hardly at all. And he said, "Where are you going?" And the only word she spoke was, "I scrubs." In other words, she was going to work somewhere to scrub floors as an 8-year-old girl. It just, it haunts me every time I look at this picture to think of how these kids lived and grew up and had to live under these conditions. So, life in Little Italy, not very pleasant to say the least, but they tried, folks. They tried to live in these neighborhoods. They usually subdivided themselves by regional origin. Sicilians stayed with Sicilians, basically. Neapolitans stayed with Neapolitans. Calabrese stayed with Calabrese. And they quarreled and they fought. They didn't like each other. They fought for each other as much as they did anyone else. But they actually tried to avoid contact as much as possible with non-Italian people. First of all, they struggled with English. Most of these people could not speak English when they came to America. And most of them could not even read their own language. And so they felt uncomfortable around other ethnic groups. And in addition to the fact they suffered religious persecution, they were almost universally Catholic. And America at this period of time was almost predominantly Protestant. And, the two religions did not necessarily get along very well together. And on top, they had to suffer the ethnic slurs, as every minority did in America. They were referred to as Dagos and Wops by the other groups, particularly the Irish, who had gone through their own discriminatory history in America earlier. Despite suffering from economic deprivation, poverty, and discrimination, they tried to hold on to their customs and traditions of the old land. They ate their traditional foods. They brought pasta and pizza to America. I think we can all say a round of applause for the pizza, right? Theaters, band concerts, choral recitals, puppet shows, social clubs. They all tried to come up with a way to somehow break this, cycle of poverty and deprivation that they were going through. The biggest event of the year was, without a doubt, the Festa, the festival, which helped the new immigrants keep a connection to the old traditions of their ancestral villages. These festas usually involved an elaborate procession through the streets in honor of a patron saint or the Virgin Mary, where a large statue was carried, trailed by a team of musicians. And all this was followed by food, fireworks, general merriment, dances, which made the festa kind of an important occasion. And folks, in the big cities in America today, the festas still go on. I know where I live now in Michigan, there are some large Italian communities around, and I know that they've been advertising their festas here, as a lot of other ethnic groups have been. So, this is a picture of one of the festas that went on in New York City. You can see it. By the way, if you're a fan of the Godfather movies, which I am, I've told you that before, in The Godfather Part 2, much of the opening of that movie is centered around the festa, where the young Vito Corleone becomes a man by making his bones, by killing the old, Padrone, the old mustache Pete that rules that neighborhood. And so this was a typical, festa that went on during the period of time. And again, just looking at the picture is worth 1,000 words. They're all dressed up. They're trying their best to kind of keep hold of their old world traditions. You can see some musicians here that are playing, no doubt, ethnic music. Very interesting photograph. I love that photograph. So, out of all this slum, out of all this deprivation, out of all this economic, deprivation, sprung what we generally refer to as the Black Hand. Now, the Black Hand was kind of the precursor to what we call the American Mafia. Most Italians came to America in pursuit of the American dream. But when they got here, that dream, unfortunately, ended up being a nightmare for a lot of them. They were lured here by unscrupulous labor brokers called padrones who seldom fulfilled their promises. And unemployment was really, really common in the Italian community. And even when you could get a job, it was the absolutely lowest level of jobs that you could find. Tending the scow, which was basically scraping off the garbage off the barges into the harbor. They used to take the garbage of New York City and float it out on barges into the harbor and scrape it off. Rag picking, where they went about and picked up rags. Women and children were often forced to take jobs in sweatshops or engage in piecework. Nobody was too young to work, as I just showed you that picture of little Susie, saying she scrubs. They worked as children, a lot of them. As a result, facing this economic deprivation, a lot of Italian men resorted to criminal enterprises. They began to rob, they began to extort, they began counterfeiting was a big crime amongst the urban areas of Little Italy, gambling, a lot of illicit schemes. And these young criminals often formed street gangs, and where they would provide protection from other gangs. This was the general way they did it. They would go to a business and say, we hear that there's a group of boys that are going to break your windows and steal all your stuff. If you will pay us X number of dollars, we will make sure that doesn't happen. Well, of course, who was going to do it was them, and, sure enough, if you didn't pay the protection money, that's what happened. And so it got to be a way that they would make money by offering protection. Again, kind of going back to the old Sicilian way of life. These gangs were often based on traditional criminal organizations for the old country, like the Black Hand, which kind of an early precursor to the American Mafia. Now, the Black Hand had been around for a long time in Italy. The origin can be traced back to Naples as early as 1750. But the American version of the group was brought to America by its earliest Italian immigrants in the 1880s. By 1900, most of the large cities you could find Black Hand groups operating. And here's how they operated. Their tactics involved sending a letter to a victim threatening bodily harm, kidnapping, arson, murder, demanding a sum of money. They would say basically, if you don't want your daughter kidnapped, pay us this much money. These letters were usually adorned with threatening symbols such as a smoking gun, a hangman's noose, a skull or knife, and were almost always signed with a hand drawn in thick black ink. And the term really became synonymous with the idea of an organized criminal conspiracy within the Italian community. Now, again, last week I gave you a disclaimer. I want to make sure and say it again, folks. This was a very small minority of the Italian community. They preyed on their own. This was not the majority of the Italians. Most of the majority of the Italian community, all they wanted to do was take part in this American dream and pull themselves up by the bootstrap and give themselves a chance. And they did, folks. Most of them came out ahead. But there was a small minority, just as there was amongst the other ethnic groups, like the Jewish ethnic groups, the Irish ethnic groups, the Asian ethnic groups. There was always a small minority that would resort to crime. So here's an example, the Black Hand. Here's an actual letter from the Black Hand. Beware, we are desperate. Mr. Angelo, we must have $1,000. Give it to us or we'll take your Maria and blow up your shop, the Black Hand. And here's a photograph, again, that Jacob Riis took, which obviously shows you some men lurking along an alley. I don't know if these were Black Hand men or not, but they obviously weren't out scraping the scow. That's for sure. They weren't rag picking. They were out for nefarious operations, without a doubt. Okay, now, one of the cities where the Black Hand first grew was New Orleans. Now, you might say, why New Orleans? Well, remember, New Orleans was probably the second biggest port in America. And people that didn't come through Ellis Island later or through New York City many times would come through New Orleans. And New Orleans had a very large Italian community at the turn of the century. And the Black Hand really gained a presence there really rapidly. The Italian immigrants soon divided into two rival factions in New Orleans, sought control of what was known as what we call now the French Quarter. Believe it or not, the French Quarter used to be called Little Palermo. In 1869, the first godfather of New Orleans, that's our title for him. I'm sure he didn't call himself that. Raphael Agnello was assassinated by a rival for power, Joseph Maquia. And it triggered what was called the Black Hand War, which lasted for years and resulted in hundreds of deaths. So for several years in New Orleans, there was a war between these two Black Hand groups. By 1890, New Orleans had decided they were going to put an end to this. And they elected a man or appointed a man by the name of David Hennessy, an Irishman, as a police chief. Hennessy, by the way, had a little bit of a checkered past himself. He had actually murdered the New Orleans chief of detectives prior to being appointed the chief of police, and he went to trial and was found innocent. I don't know the actual whereabouts of the case, but it must have been something unusual to say the least. Well, he decided he was going to rid the city of the Black Hand. He was Irish. The Irish and Italians traditionally did not get along very well in these big urban centers in this period of time. On the night of October 15th, 1890, he was walking home and he was killed by a shotgun blast. And upon being found by some of his neighbors, he lived long enough to blame his death on the Black Hand. That's not what he said, but I'm not going to repeat what he said because it was a pretty bad ethnic slur. Hysteria swept the city, and within days, over 250 suspected Black Hand members were arrested and jailed, with 19 eventually being charged with murder, including Joseph Maquia. And after a quick trial, all were found innocent, but were kept in prison for other crimes. But that evening, after the trial, thousands of irate New Orleans citizens stormed the prison, broke out the suspects, and with 11 of the 19, including Maquia, being shot or lynched, the incident is still regarded as the largest mass lynching in U.S. history. Kind of surprising. I didn't realize this until I began studying this a little bit, that this was actually the largest incident of mass lynching. This is Chief Police David Hennessy, the man that decided he was going to rid New Orleans of the Black Hand, and instead they rid him. And here's a photograph of Little Palermo in New Orleans, what we now call the French Quarter. And this is a photograph of the not the actual lynching, but they're storming the police building and the jail to break out the prisoners of the Black Hand and lynch them. So most of the victims of the Black Hand, as we've seen, were small business owners. That doesn't mean the wealthy weren't targeted. In fact, they most certainly were. And one of the most famous of those that were targeted by the Black Hand was Enrico Caruso. We just listened to a little bit of his opera singing just at the beginning of this. Enrico Caruso was born in Naples, Italy. And by 1900, he had become probably the most celebrated opera singers in the world. He just was, no one could touch him. In 1903, he made his American debut at the Metropolitan Opera. He signed a lucrative recording contract with the Victor Company. And so, not surprisingly, this success drew the attention of the Black Hand. And so they decided they were going to extort him. And they sent him a letter, a group gives the Black Hand and Dagger, demanding $2,000. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot in American money. Today, that would have been $65,000. So that was a pretty good sum of money, folks. The extortionists threatened to kidnap his family or damage his vocal cords with lies. They said, if we'll either kidnap your family, and if that doesn't work, we'll kidnap you and destroy your vocal cords with lie. Well, he finally decided he was going to do it and basically gave in and sent the money. But the plot became public, and that angered the Black Hand. And so they decided they were going to, uh, basically extort him again. He received a second Black Hand letter demanding $15,000. That was almost $500,000 in American money. Now, folks, Enrico Caruso was no doubt a very wealthy man, but that's a lot of money even for a wealthy person. So he decided he was going to report the incident to the police, even though they told him not to. And due to the efforts of a New York PD detective by the name of Joseph Petrosino, he devised a sting operation, and they arrested two of the members of the Black Hand and put them in prison. So this is Enrico Caruso. We're going to hear more of Joseph Petrosino because he becomes very involved in breaking the Black Hand in New York City. Like I said, New Orleans was the first city that kind of really had a large Black Hand presence. Pardon me. But it was obviously New York City where the masses of Sicilian and Italian immigrants settled that the Black Hand really became well known. By 1920, as I've told you, nearly 1 million Italian immigrants lived in the New York City area. And the Black Hand saw an easy target within these insular Italians, which traditionally avoided the Irish-dominated police department. Remember, they had this old world custom of omerta. They did not believe in involving the courts and the legal authorities. And particularly, since a lot of the police department employed Irishmen. And again, the Irish and the Italians did not necessarily get along very well. Faced with soaring crime in the Italian neighborhoods, the New York PD finally recruited its first Italian-speaking officer, Giuseppe Joe Petrosino, in 1883. And he soon became so effective at what he was doing, combating crime in the Italian neighborhood, that the police commissioner, who just happened to be Teddy Roosevelt at that time, promoted him to detective. And he just really ended a lot of the Black Hand crime in New York City. He arrested over 500 Black Hand criminals and put them in prison himself. He was also very involved with some other large crimes, which gained him a lot of notoriety. Besides the Caruso sting operation, one of Petrosino's most important cases involved his infiltration of an anarchist organization suspected of having ties to the assassination of the King of Italy. It was King Umberto I at that time. He discovered that this group was going to try to assassinate President William McKinley. And so he warned the Secret Service. He said, folks, you got an anarchist group, which I've infiltrated, and they're going to try to kill McKinley. They kind of ignored him. They said, I'm sure there was some, discrimination going on here. They probably felt like, he was an Italian, probably didn't know what he was talking about. Well, as we all know, or I hope we all know, McKinley was indeed assassinated by Leon Kozlov, who was a socialist of Polish ancestry. He was not a Black Hand member, but he was an anarchist. And he was McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo in September 1901. And once it became known that Petrosino had warned the Secret Service, he just grew in notoriety. So this is Giuseppe Joe Petrosino. This is William McKinley. The president was assassinated, and the man that assassinated Leon Kozlov. So these people here were all kind of interrelated in one way or the other. Now, what happened to Petrosino? Well, by 1909, Petrosino was the head of what was generally called the Italian Squad in New York City, made up of Italian police officers, all of which spoke Italian and were familiar with the old world traditions of the mafia. They were extremely effective in combating the Black Hand in Little Italy. And it was then that the New York City Police Commissioner, wasn't Teddy Roosevelt anymore, decided to send Petrosino on a secret assignment to Sicily. What had happened was Congress had passed a brand new law which allowed for the deportation of any alien who had lived in the United States for less than 3 years and who had been previously convicted of a crime in another country. So if you came from Sicily to America and you had come to Sicily as a result of a crime, and you were in America and you were, found, you were arrested for a crime here, you could be deported, not because you committed a crime here necessarily, but because you committed a crime in your home country. So Petrosino was to go back to Sicily and investigate some of the backgrounds of the known Black Hand associates here in America to see if they had broken any laws in Sicily so they could be deported. Well, the problem was, by this time, Petrosino was a well-known person and such a highly publicized figure that even though his assignment was supposed to be secret, everybody knew it was happening. And within days after he arrived at Palermo in Sicily, he was gunned down in daylight at a crowded piazza standing near a statue of Garibaldi, the old, rebel leader of Sicily. He was shot in the face, an age-old penalty for treason, according to mafia tradition. So, if you were a traitor in their mind, they would try to shoot you in the face to make sure everybody knew that, hey, this is what happens if you commit treason against the Sicilians. The man that was suspected of it was the biggest Sicilian padrino, the head of the mob in Sicily, Vito Ferro. And he was widely suspected of the murder. He was never arrested. By the way, you're going to hear of Ferro again in a few weeks. So, I'll remind you who he was. Petrosino's body was returned to New York, and his funeral drew an estimated 25,000 viewers who lined the streets to pay tribute to the fallen detective. The next day, the New York PD received a letter which named several Italian gangs who had arranged for Petrosino's murder. So it was American Black Handers that basically arranged for his murder in Sicily at the hand of the mafia. It included the names of Joe Morello and his three half-brothers, Vincenzo, Nicola, and Ciro Terranova. They, in turn, would be the first Sicilian crime family to rule New York City. They would basically gain control of all of New York City in the early part of the 1900s. And they are kind of the forerunners of what we now call the American Mafia. This is an arrival, Petrosino's remains. It's a big deal, folks. He was a hero to many Italian Americans for what he did. So I always kind of try to let you know of a book out there in case somebody's interested in reading a little bit more about all this stuff. There's a really good book, I understand, called The Black Hand, the epic war between a brilliant detective, Petrosino, and deadliest secret society in American history. I've not read the book, I'll be honest with you. I just haven't had time to read this one. But I have read reviews of it, and they say it's just a really good book. This book I have read. In fact, I've read this book several times. The American Mafia, A History of Its Rise to Power. It is just, I have to tell you, if you're interested in the early origin of the American Mafia in America, this is the best book out there. There are a lot of books about the American Mafia. I don't think there's any of them any better in discussing the early history of the American Mafia. It's just tremendously well done. It really talks a lot about the New Orleans era with the Black Hand. It talks about the Morello crime family, which we're going to talk a little bit about next week, the era of what's called the Mustache Pete's, because that's what we're going to talk about. And that's the term the Italians use for these guys. Again, that's not my term. I didn't create this term, and I don't use it derisively. This is a term they called these criminals, the Mustache Pete's, because they all tended to wear the big, large, drooping mustaches. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. The first organized gangsters in New York City, the Mustache Pete's. So I hope this has been of interest to you. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I've just really enjoyed putting it together. It's been one of the things that I've had more fun with than just about anything else since I've done my presentations on rock and roll in the 1950s and 60s. That's still my favorite, but this is one of my favorites. So I hope you enjoyed it, and next week we'll get back with it, and we will see you soon. Bye bye.